Life is a way of giving you a false sense of security right before it turns everything upside down. For me, that false sense of security was a picture-perfect family. My name's Alan Cooper, just a regular guy with a decent job, a beautiful wife, Melissa, and a 21-year-old son, Ethan, who'd just started figuring out adulthood. It was mid-August when the wedding invitation arrived. My younger brother, Jack, always the golden boy of the family, was getting married in Denver. Jack and I were opposites. While I worked a 9-to-5 job and lived in a quiet New Hampshire suburb, Jack traveled the world and had stories about everything from scuba diving in Fiji to getting lost in the Amazon. Melissa and I always joked that Jack would never settle down. But here we were, staring at the thick, cream-colored invitation with his fiancée's name embossed in gold foil. Jack Cooper and Sophie Harper cordially invite you. Looks fancy, I said, tossing the invitation onto the kitchen counter. Melissa picked it up, running her fingers over the embossed lettering. She smiled, but it wasn't her usual smile. It was tighter, like she was suppressing something. "It's going to be a beautiful wedding," she said. She seemed unusually excited, almost giddy. I figured it was just Melissa being Melissa, always loving the idea of romance and celebration. "I'll book the hotel," I said. "Let me handle it," she replied quickly. It wasn't a big deal, but the way she jumped at the chance to plan the trip felt odd. Still, I let it slide. Ethan, our son, had always been close to Melissa. Too close sometimes. They had inside jokes I didn't get, and I'd always chalked it up to the mother-son bond one envied but didn't fully understand. When I told him about Jack's wedding, he shrugged, barely looking up from his phone. "Sure. Whatever," he said. "Whatever. It's your uncle's wedding," I said. "We'll have a good time. Family bonding." He rolled his eyes. "Yeah. Can't wait for the awkward family dinner conversations." "Ethan," Melissa said sharply, appearing in the doorway. Her tone made me glance up. She had that look, the one that said, "Don't push him." Ethan muttered an apology and wandered out of the room. Melissa stayed behind, fidgeting with the corner of the invitation. "He's just going through a lot right now," she said. "What's he going through?" I asked, genuinely curious. Ethan was in college, had a part-time job, and a decent group of friends. As far as I knew, he had it easier than I did at his age. Melissa hesitated, her eyes darting toward the hallway, where Ethan had disappeared. "Nothing serious. Just stress. School stuff." Her explanation felt like a brush-off, but I let it go. It didn't seem worth an argument. The weeks leading up to the wedding flew by. Melissa spent hours meticulously planning our outfits, packing, and even suggesting we arrive a day early to help Jack out. I joked about her being more invested in this wedding than our own, but she just laughed it off. Ethan, on the other hand, became increasingly withdrawn. He skipped family dinners, stayed out late, and avoided conversations. At one point, I tried to talk to him about his behavior, but he shut me down with a curt, "I'm fine, Dad. Stop overthinking. I figured it was just a phase. College kids, right?" The morning we left for Denver, Melissa was unusually quiet. Normally, she'd be double-checking every detail, but she seemed distracted, staring out the window as I drove us to the airport. Ethan sat in the back seat, headphones on, completely tuned out. "Excited to see Jack?" I asked, trying to break the silence. Melissa blinked, as if pulled out of a daydream. Oh yeah, of course." Her voice sounded hollow. "Ethan?" I tried. He pulled one headphone off and muttered, "Sure." Melissa glanced at him in the rearview mirror, her expression unreadable. The unease I felt was like a mosquito bite, small, irritating, but easy to ignore. I told myself I was imagining things. This was supposed to be a celebration, a family event, nothing more. But in hindsight, the tension in that car ride was the first crack in the foundation of my life. I just didn't see it yet. Denver was beautiful that time of year. The mountains loomed in the distance, and the air was crisp and dry. Jack had booked a charming, rustic venue, a sprawling estate with manicured gardens and a stunning view of the Rockies. When we arrived at the hotel, Melissa immediately disappeared to check on Jack. Ethan went off to explore the area, leaving me alone in our room. I unpacked our bags, flipping through channels on the hotel TV, feeling an odd sense of loneliness. Melissa didn't return until late, claiming she'd been caught up in wedding prep. Ethan came back looking flustered, his shirt rumpled, but I didn't ask questions. That night, as I lay in bed next to Melissa, staring at the ceiling, a strange thought crossed my mind. Why does this trip feel so off? I couldn't have known then that the answer would destroy everything I thought I knew about my family. If the arrival in Denver felt off, the rehearsal dinner turned my unease into a slow, simmering suspicion. It wasn't one thing. It was a collection of tiny moments that didn't sit right. Jack, being Jack, had pulled out all the stops for the night before the wedding. The venue for the rehearsal dinner was a swanky rooftop restaurant with fairy lights strung across the ceiling and a panoramic view of the Denver skyline. Melissa, in a navy cocktail dress that hugged her figure perfectly, looked radiant. Ethan, on the other hand, looked like he wanted to be anywhere but there. "You look great," I told Melissa as we entered the restaurant. She gave me a distracted smile, her eyes scanning the room. "Thanks. Oh, there's Jack," she said, excusing herself before I could say anything else. As I watched her stride toward Jack, something gnawed at me. It wasn't just her excitement. It was the way she kept glancing back at Ethan. The dinner was a mix of toasts, laughter, and the usual chaos that came with gathering family. Jack was his usual charismatic self, working the room and introducing Sophie's side of the family to ours. Melissa seemed to float between conversations, but every so often, I caught her looking at Ethan. Ethan, for his part, stayed glued to his seat, nursing a glass of water like it was something stronger. When I sat next to him, he barely acknowledged me. "Everything okay?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "Yeah, Dad, I'm fine," he said, not looking up. "You don't seem fine." He sighed and finally met my gaze. "I'm just tired, okay? It's been a long day." Before I could press further, Melissa appeared beside us. "Alan, come meet Sophie's parents," she said, her tone a little too cheerful. "I'll be right back," I told Ethan, giving his shoulder a reassuring squeeze. Halfway through the dinner, I stepped out to the patio for some fresh air. The view was breathtaking. Twinkling city lights below, the Rockies silhouetted against the night sky. I sipped my drink, trying to shake the strange feeling that had been building all day. Then I saw them. Through the glass doors leading back into the restaurant, I caught a glimpse of Melissa and Ethan standing near the bar. They were talking, but their body language was off. Melissa had her hand on Ethan's arm, and he looked angry. I took a step closer, leaning against the glass to get a better view. Melissa was speaking rapidly, her expression intense. Ethan pulled his arm away and turned his back on her, walking off. Melissa stood there for a moment, looking flustered, before smoothing her dress and rejoining the party. Later that night, back at the hotel, I decided to address it. Melissa was in the bathroom getting ready for bed when I brought it up. "You and Ethan seem to have a moment tonight," I said, keeping my tone casual. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice muffled through the bathroom door. "At the bar. I saw you two talking." He looked upset. The door opened, and Melissa emerged, already in her pajamas. "Oh, that? He's just stressed about school. You know how he gets?" That explanation again. I nodded, but something about the way she said it felt off. "Alan," she said, sitting on the edge of the bed, "you need to stop worrying so much. This weekend is about Jack, okay? Let's just enjoy it." Her tone was soothing, but it also felt dismissive. I let it go for the moment. The next morning was the rehearsal itself. The venue, a picturesque garden surrounded by towering pines, looked like something out of a fairy tale. Melissa was busy chatting with Jack and Sophie, while Ethan lingered on the outskirts, his hands stuffed in his pockets. I decided to approach him. "Hey, you okay?" "Dad, I'm fine." "Can you stop asking me that?" he snapped. I was taken aback by his tone. "Whoa, I'm just trying to help." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Sorry, I didn't mean to snap. I don't know. It's been a weird trip." I wanted to ask what he meant, but before I could, Melissa appeared. "Ethan, can you help me with something?" she asked, her voice overly bright. "Sure," he muttered, following her toward the venue's main building. I watched them go, a strange heaviness settling in my chest. That evening, during the rehearsal dinner, the tension reached a breaking point. Ethan disappeared halfway through the meal, and Melissa followed not long after. I decided to look for them. Wandering through the dimly lit hallways of the venue, I finally found them in the garden outside. Melissa was speaking in hushed tones, her back to me. Ethan stood a few feet away, his arms crossed. "Can't keep doing this," I heard Melissa say. "Then stop," Ethan shot back, his voice low but angry. "What the hell is going on?" I asked, stepping out of the shadows. They both froze. Melissa turned to me, her face pale. "Alan, it's not what it looks like." Ethan wouldn't even meet my eyes. "What does it look like?" I asked, my voice shaking. Melissa opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Ethan muttered something under his breath and stormed off. I stood there, staring at Melissa. "What's going on?" I demanded. "Alan, please," she said, reaching for my arm. "Not here. Not now." Her avoidance only fueled my anger. "Then when?" "Because right now, it looks like there's something you're not telling me." She didn't respond, and I didn't push. But as we walked back to the party, a single thought kept running through my mind. Something is very, very wrong. The morning of the wedding dawned with the kind of flawless weather you'd expect to see on a postcard. Clear skies, a gentle breeze, and the sun casting a warm glow over the mountain range. It should have been a perfect day, but for me it felt like waiting for the other shoe to drop. Melissa was up early, bustling around the hotel room, fixing her hair and makeup with an energy that felt forced. Ethan, however, was uncharacteristically slow getting ready. He barely said a word as he slipped on his suit, his movements sluggish, like he was dreading the day ahead. "You're unusually quiet," I said as I adjusted my tie in the mirror. Ethan glanced at me, his expression unreadable. "Just tired." I turned to Melissa. "What about you? You've been running around like it's your wedding day." She laughed nervously. "Don't be ridiculous, Alan. I just want everything to go smoothly for Jack." Her tone was light, but her hands trembled as she smoothed down her dress. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Jack stood at the altar with Sophie, his smile as bright as the sun. The officiant spoke about love, commitment, and family, but the words barely registered. My focus kept drifting to Melissa and Ethan, seated beside me. Melissa sat rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Ethan fidgeted with his cufflinks, avoiding eye contact with everyone. At one point, during the vows, I caught Melissa stealing a glance at Ethan. It was brief, but it wasn't motherly concern. It was something else. I felt a knot form in my stomach. After the ceremony, as guests mingled and congratulated the newlyweds, I found myself watching Melissa and Ethan more closely. Every interaction between them seemed loaded, as though they were speaking an unspoken language only they understood. During the cocktail hour, I caught them standing together near the edge of the garden. Melissa leaned in close, whispering something to Ethan. He nodded, his jaw tight. I approached, trying to mask my unease with a smile. "What are you two plotting over here?" Melissa jumped, her face flushed. "Oh, nothing. Just telling Ethan to behave himself tonight," she said with a nervous laugh. Ethan looked at me, his eyes almost pleading, but he said nothing. By the time we moved to the reception hall, the knot in my stomach had turned into a full-blown ache. The reception was held in a grand ballroom with vaulted ceilings, sparkling chandeliers, and a dance floor that seemed to glow under the soft lighting. Guests laughed and toasted, the atmosphere buzzing with joy. But for me, the air felt heavy. I kept catching Ethan and Melissa exchanging glances. They weren't the kind of glances you'd expect between a mother and son. They were furtive, almost guilty. The breaking point came during the first dance. Jack and Sophie twirled around the dance floor, their love on full display. As everyone clapped and cheered, I noticed Melissa slip away from the table. Moments later, Ethan followed. I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding. Then I stood up and quietly followed them. I found them in a small corridor off the main hall, their voices low but heated. "This has to stop," Ethan was saying. "I know," Melissa replied, her voice shaking. "But I don't know how to fix this." "Fix it? You shouldn't have started it," Ethan snapped. I froze, my mind racing. What were they talking about? My chest tightened as I stepped closer, straining to hear more. "I can't do this anymore, Mom," Ethan said. "Dad's gonna figure it out." My blood ran cold. Melissa reached out to touch his arm. "Please, Ethan, let's just get through this weekend." Before I could stop myself, I stepped into the corridor. What the hell is going on? They both turned to me, their faces pale. Alan, Melissa started, her voice trembling. Don't, I said, my voice low and dangerous. I looked at Ethan, who wouldn't meet my gaze. What does he mean, you can't do this anymore? What have you been doing? Neither of them spoke. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. Answer me, I roared. Melissa flinched, tears welling in her eyes. It's not what you think. It sure as hell looks like what I think, I shot back. Ethan finally looked at me, his face contorted with guilt. Dad, I'm sorry. The weight of those words hit me like a freight train. My knees went weak, and I had to steady myself against the wall. Are you telling me? My voice broke, unable to finish the sentence. Melissa reached for me, but I jerked away. Don't touch me, I said, my voice trembling with rage. Alan, please, she said, her voice breaking. It just happened. It just happened? I repeated, my voice rising. You're sleeping with our son, and you think you can explain it away like some kind of accident. Ethan stepped forward. Dad, it's not like that. Shut up, I shouted, the sound echoing down the corridor. I turned to Melissa, my eyes burning with betrayal. How long? Alan, how long? I demanded. She hesitated, her lips trembling. A few months? The ground felt like it was collapsing beneath me. A few months? I whispered. I looked at Ethan, who looked like he wanted to disappear. And you? I said, my voice cold. You went along with this? Your own mother? He opened his mouth, but no words came out. I laughed bitterly, the sound hollow. You're both disgusting. I turned and walked away, ignoring Melissa's desperate calls. The world around me blurred as I pushed through the crowded reception hall, my chest heaving with anger and heartbreak. This wasn't just betrayal. This was something deeper, darker, a violation of everything I thought I knew about the people I loved most. And the worst part? It wasn't over. When I stormed back into the reception hall, the lights and music felt surreal, like I'd stepped into some twisted dream. Couples were laughing, twirling on the dance floor, oblivious to the chaos unraveling inside me. I made my way to the bar, ignoring the friendly nods and smiles from distant relatives, and ordered a double whiskey. My hands trembled as I brought the glass to my lips. The burn in my throat wasn't enough to drown out the rage and betrayal that churned in my gut. My mind replayed their words, Melissa's shaky, it just happened, Ethan's pathetic, I'm sorry. How'd I miss this? How had my own wife and son managed to hide something so vile, so destructive? I barely registered the presence beside me until I heard my brother's voice. Alan? You good, man? Jack's expression was a mix of concern and confusion. I forced a tight smile, but I could tell he wasn't buying it. Yeah, just needed a breather. You sure? He pressed. You look off. I almost laughed at the understatement. I'm fine. It's your big day. Go enjoy it. Jack studied me for a moment longer before nodding. All right, but let me know if you need anything. As he walked away, I glanced across the room and spotted Melissa standing near the edge of the dance floor. She was scanning the crowd, clearly looking for me. Her face was pale, her movements tense. I couldn't deal with her. Not yet. Not here. Ethan was nowhere to be seen, which was just as well. I wasn't sure what I'd do if I had to face him again so soon. The whiskey did little to calm me, so I left the bar and stepped outside onto the terrace. The cool evening air hit me like a slap, but it wasn't enough to clear my head. I needed answers. After a few minutes, I heard soft footsteps behind me. I turned, expecting Melissa, but it was Ethan. He hesitated at the doorway, his shoulders slumped, his hands jammed into his pockets. What do you want? I snapped. Dad, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry. I don't know how it got to this point. You don't know? I interrupted, my voice rising. You're sleeping with your mother, Ethan. How do you not know how it got to this point? He winced, his face crumpling. It wasn't supposed to happen. Stop saying that. I shouted, taking a step toward him. You think that makes it better? You think that excuse is what you've done? Ethan looked away, his jaw tightening. I never meant to hurt you. I laughed bitterly, the sound echoing in the still night air. Well, congratulations, son. You've done a hell of a job anyway. Before I could say more, Melissa appeared in the doorway. Alan, please, she said, her voice pleading. Don't you dare please me, I said, pointing a finger at her. You don't get to play the victim here, Melissa. She stepped closer, her hands outstretched as if to calm me. I know what I did was unforgivable, but we need to talk about this. Privately? Privately? I repeated, incredulous. You think we can sweep this under the rug and have a nice little chat? At Jack's wedding? No less? Alan, lower your voice, she said, glancing nervously over her shoulder. No, I said, my voice firm. I'm done lowering my voice. You two have been sneaking around behind my back for months. Months? And you expect me to just stay quiet about it? Ethan took a step forward. Dad, it's not all Mom's fault. Don't, I said, cutting him off. Don't you dare try to defend her. Or yourself. Melissa started to cry, her hands trembling as she wiped at her cheeks. I didn't mean for this to happen, Alan. I swear. It just one thing led to another, and what? I shouted. And you decided to throw away our marriage? Our family? For what? For him. I gestured wildly at Ethan, who flinched. Melissa's sobs grew louder, but I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. The betrayal was too fresh, too raw. The door to the terrace creaked open again, and this time it was Jack. What's going on out here? He asked, looking between the three of us. Nothing, Melissa said quickly, wiping her face. Doesn't look like nothing, Jack said, his brow furrowing. Alan? I hesitated, the weight of the truth threatening to spill over. But as much as I wanted to expose them, I couldn't bring myself to ruin Jack's wedding any further. Just a family disagreement, I said finally, my voice tight. Jack didn't look convinced, but he nodded slowly. All right, just keep it together, okay? Sophie's parents are here, and they don't need any drama. Melissa nodded quickly, but I stayed silent. When Jack left, I turned back to Melissa and Ethan. This isn't over, I said coldly. But right now you're both going to go back in there and act like everything is fine. Do you understand me? Melissa nodded, her eyes red and swollen. Ethan looked at the ground, his silence infuriating me even more. I left them standing there and returned to the reception, my head spinning. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I barely registered the toasts, the laughter, or the dancing. All I could think about was the betrayal and what I was going to do about it. That night, back at the hotel, I slept in a chair while Melissa cried herself to sleep. Ethan didn't return to his room until well after midnight, and when he did, he avoided me completely. I sat in the dark, staring at the city lights outside the window, my mind racing. This wasn't just about anger or betrayal. It was about destruction. My family, my life, everything I'd built was crumbling around me. And somehow, I had to figure out how to pick up the pieces. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the stiff hotel chair, the city lights casting long shadows across the room as Melissa lay curled on the bed, her back to me. She'd stopped crying hours ago, but I could hear her uneven breathing, could feel the weight of her guilt hanging between us like a storm cloud. Ethan's room was next door. Every creak of the floor, every muffled sound made my fists clench. I didn't know what I'd do if I saw him again, but I knew it wouldn't end well. The next morning, the wedding buzz was still in full swing. Guests packed the hotel lobby, chatting and laughing as they checked out or planned brunches with family. The whole world seemed to move on, blissfully unaware of the wreckage hidden in plain sight. I wasn't ready to face anyone. I slipped out early, grabbing a coffee and sitting on a bench outside the hotel. The cool morning air did little to calm the storm in my head. That's when Jack found me. Hey, he said, sitting down beside me. I didn't look at him. Hey, you're not exactly blending in, he said, motioning to my rumpled clothes and the dark circles under my eyes. Rough night, I said flatly. Jack was silent for a moment. Look, I didn't want to pry last night, but is something going on? I laughed bitterly. You could say that. He studied me, his brows furrowed. Does it have to do with Melissa and Ethan? My head snapped toward him. What do you mean? Jack hesitated. I don't know. It's just they were acting weird yesterday. I thought maybe it was just family tension or something, but now... He trailed off, waiting for me to fill in the blanks. I wanted to tell him everything, to unload the truth, and let someone else carry the weight of it for a while. But this was his wedding weekend, and I couldn't ruin that for him. It's nothing, I said finally. Just a misunderstanding. Jack didn't look convinced, but he nodded anyway. If you need to talk, you know where to find me. Thanks, I muttered. Back in the room, Melissa was sitting on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked up when I entered, her eyes red and puffy. We need to talk, she said softly. Yeah, we do, I said, shutting the door behind me. She took a deep breath, but the words seemed to stick in her throat. I don't even know where to start. How about with the truth? I said, my voice cold. Melissa flinched but nodded. It started a few months ago. Ethan was going through a rough time, and I don't know. I thought I was helping him. Helping him? I snapped. You call what you did helping. Tears streamed down her face. I know it was wrong, Alan. I know I betrayed you. I betrayed everything we built. But it wasn't about you. I laughed bitterly. Oh, that makes me feel so much better. She shook her head, her sobs growing louder. I don't have an excuse. I don't know what happened to me. What about Ethan? I asked. What's his excuse? Melissa hesitated, her silence cutting deeper than any words could. Right, I said, standing. I thought so. Ethan knocked on the door a few minutes later. Melissa let him in, and we stood in a tense triangle, the silence thick and suffocating. I don't know what to say, Ethan said, his voice shaky. I messed up. We both did. You think? I said, glaring at him. Dad, I never wanted to hurt you, he said. I don't even know how it got this far. That seems to be the theme around here, I said. No one knows how or why it happened. It just did, like some cosmic accident. Ethan looked at the floor, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. I'm sorry, he said again, his voice barely audible. Sorry doesn't cut it, I said. Not for this. Melissa tried to step in. Alan, we need to figure out how to move forward. Move forward, I said, my voice rising. With what? With this? I gestured between the two of them. You think there's a way to come back from this? Neither of them answered. By the time we left the hotel, the tension was unbearable. I drove in silence, Melissa sitting stiffly beside me while Ethan rode in the back, staring out the window. When we got home, I didn't unpack. I didn't say a word. I grabbed a suitcase, threw in enough clothes for a week, and walked out the door. Alan, wait, Melissa called after me. I stopped in the doorway, turning to face her. I can't be here right now, I said. I can't look at either of you. She started to cry again, but I couldn't bring myself to care. I checked into a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where the air smelled faintly of mildew, and the TV only got 3 channels. It was a far cry from the life I'd built, but it was quiet. For the first time in days, I was alone with my thoughts. And as much as I hated to admit it, those thoughts weren't just about anger or betrayal. They were about failure. I'd failed as a husband. I'd failed as a father. And now, I was paying the price. The next morning, Ethan called me. I let it go to voicemail. Then he texted, Dad, I need to talk to you. Please. I ignored it. But later that afternoon, he sent another message that stopped me cold. There's something you don't know. Please let me explain. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. What else could there possibly be? I stared at Ethan's message on my phone, the words blurring as my mind raced. Asterisk, there's something you don't know. Asterisk, what could possibly be left to explain? What could he or Melissa say that would make any of this less horrific? Against my better judgment, I called him. He answered on the first ring. Dad, what do you want, Ethan? I said, my voice cold. Can we meet? I need to tell you something. Face to face. I hesitated. The last thing I wanted was to see him, but curiosity and anger gnawed at me. Fine, I said. Where? We met at a diner on the edge of town. The place was quiet, the hum of fluorescent lights mingling with the clink of coffee cups and muffled conversations. Ethan was already seated in a corner booth when I arrived, looking more haggard than I'd ever seen him. I slid into the seat across from him, keeping my expression neutral. Talk. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, running a hand through his hair. First, I just want to say I'm sorry. I know that doesn't mean much right now, but I didn't come here for an apology, I said. You said there was something I didn't know. He nodded, swallowing hard. There is. About why this happened. Don't you dare try to justify it. I warned. I'm not, he said quickly. You need to understand. It wasn't just some random thing, Dad. It had started because I was angry at you. I blinked, his words catching me off guard. Angry at me? For what? For everything, he said, his voice rising. For always being so distant. For caring more about work than our family. For leaving Mom to pick up the pieces when you weren't around. That's ridiculous, I snapped. I worked hard to provide for this family. Everything I did was for you and your mother. Ethan shook his head, his eyes glistening. You weren't there, Dad. Not really. You never asked about my life, never showed up to my games, never. I was busy building a life for us, I interrupted. And in the process, you forgot to actually be in it, he shot back. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. Was there truth in what he was saying? Had I been so focused on providing that I'd missed the bigger picture? Ethan looked away, his voice dropping to a whisper. I was so angry at you. And Mom, she was lonely. I knew it was wrong. But I wanted to hurt you. My breath caught in my throat. So this was revenge? You slept with your mother to punish me? I didn't plan for it to happen, he said, his voice breaking. It got out of hand. I sat back, staring at him in disbelief. Out of hand? I repeated. Ethan, this isn't a mistake you can just walk away from. This is beyond comprehension. He nodded, tears streaming down his face. I know, and I hate myself for it. I needed you to know the truth. The ride back to the motel was a blur. Ethan's words replayed in my head, each one cutting deeper than the last. I'd failed him. I'd failed Melissa. And in their brokenness, they destroyed everything we'd built. When I got back to the motel, Melissa was waiting outside. She looked pale and tired, her makeup smudged as if she'd been crying for hours. Alan, she said softly, stepping toward me. What are you doing here? I asked, my voice devoid of emotion. I needed to see you. I needed to tell you how sorry I am. I opened the door to my room and gestured for her to follow. Once inside, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the worn carpet. You want to talk? Fine. Start by explaining how you could do this to me, I said. Melissa sat across from me, wringing her hands. I don't have an excuse. I was lonely. I felt unseen. And Ethan, he was there. He listened. I shook my head, disgusted. He's your son, Melissa. How do you even begin to justify that? I'm not justifying it, she cried. I know what I did was wrong. I know I've destroyed everything. But I can't take it back. All I can do is try to make it right. How? I demanded. How do you make this right? She didn't answer. The days that followed were a blur of cold, awkward conversations, and painful silences. I stayed at the motel, avoiding Melissa and Ethan as much as possible. I needed space to think, to figure out what came next. Divorce seemed inevitable, but the thought of dismantling 23 years of marriage felt like another betrayal. How do you walk away from a life you've built? From the person you once loved more than anything? Ethan moved out of the house and back to his college dorm. Melissa stayed, though I refused to speak to her beyond the bare minimum. One evening, I found myself driving aimlessly, the radio playing softly in the background. I pulled into a park, the sun dipping low on the horizon, and sat on a bench overlooking a small lake. For the first time in weeks, I let myself cry, not just for the betrayal, but for the loss of everything I thought I knew, for the man I used to be. When I finally left the park, something had shifted. I couldn't change the past. I couldn't erase what had happened, but I could decide how to move forward. A week later, I filed for divorce. Melissa didn't fight it. She knew there was no coming back from this. Ethan and I haven't spoken since that day in the diner. Maybe one day, we'll find a way to repair what's left of our relationship. But for now, the wound is too fresh. As for me, I've moved out of the house and into a small apartment across town. It's quiet, but it's mine. And for the first time in years, I'm learning to live for myself. Betrayal doesn't define you. It breaks you, yes, but what you do with the pieces is what matters.